We have 4 panelists here today. All of them are from a different member state, so everyone will have a bit of a different opinion on the matter. And also, as you will find out, some of them have a very same background in relation to the Digital Services Act, while the others have a completely different one. So for the first round of our question, I would just like to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and explain why or how is the Digital Services Act relevant for your work, and also what sort of opportunities the Digital Services Act brings into your profession.
Okay, so I'll start. Thank you, Christoph. So my name is Andrea Liebman. Thank you for the invitation. I represent the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. I don't know if I have to be this close, actually. Is this okay? And I'd like to say off the top, we're not a regulatory agency. We are, as I mentioned, Swedish Psychological Defense Agency is a government agency. We're not military, we're civilian. We report, however, to the Ministry of Defense. We have, since our elections in 2022, a Minister of Civil Defense in Sweden, and we also have a National Security Advisor. So we have several, I would say, point of contacts that we report to regularly. And just briefly about the agency and the way we work. We have, I would say, we work out of 2 pillars, so to speak. We have a long-term capacity building leg, where we educate, we present, we conduct interviews in media to reach a general audience. We have colleagues that work towards civil society and also towards the media sector. That is an independent, completely independent realm. Thus, we do not approach media, but sometimes media approaches us when they find information about disinformation attacks. And I should also say that we only look at the foreign space. We do not look at actors specifically in the domestic space at all. And many ask, how do we differentiate these 2 spaces? And I will mention just a few ways of how we work. We're not intelligence. That's the internal space. We're not law enforcement. That's the internal space, and we collaborate closely with these government agencies. The other leg is the operational leg, where we identify, analyze, and counter, I would say put forth suggestions on how to counter malign foreign information influence directed towards Sweden, Swedish interests, the population, decision-making. So we have different toolboxes when it comes to our internal space, where we look at vulnerabilities, not from an actor point of view, but it can also mean strengths. However, what can be attacked? And then we also have, by now, I would say, since it's been a few years now, we have very good knowledge about the infrastructure of adversarial actors, whether it's state, non-state, interest groups abroad, directing and targeting Sweden in various ways. Since 2022, when we opened our doors, we basically hit the ground running. Before that, we were about 15 people based at another agency, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. It's an all-hazard agency. And then in 2018, our Prime Minister at the time said, we are going to establish Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. There was an assessment period, and 2022 we opened our doors, and we've had to address a disinformation campaign directed towards Sweden by Islamist actors. We've had our process into NATO, our application, and we've also had the EU, the parliamentary elections, and we've had a lot of work where Sweden has been a focal point of both state and non-state actor interests, and with the purpose of dividing us and breaking us apart from the inside, which then the logic is that the adversarial actor is stronger. And to finish up my intro, I just would want to say our collaboration with the different organizations, I would say non-profit, media, the various target groups in Sweden. It goes from national, regional to local levels. We have a board, psychological defense, where government agencies are all intertwined now, and we can reach each other if something happens. And we also have a close dialogue with the social media and tech companies to learn from how they do and what they do and how they go about countering disinformation, and that's our perspective when it comes to the DSA and regulation, because we monitor the space closely when it comes to regulation and vis-a-vis freedom of expression to protect that space, of course. And I think I'll finish there. I can maybe just mention some of the trends that we have, that we're sitting on at the moment. I think it's just good before I hand it over. And we see that the adversarial actors, they are working now very effectively, making it harder to identify them. So this is where when we'll delve into the DSA space more, where it is a bit problematic, because we all know that disinformation is not only lies and easily identifiable. So the trend is now to move away more from the social media platforms, for example, and developing their own websites and then disseminating information from that type of infrastructure. So there is a preparatory phase, building websites and other channels, and then there is an activation phase. And this is something that, when I monitor the DSA space, I'm seeing that there is somewhat of a, I would say, it doesn't really take into account the broadened infrastructure that's now taking place. Thank you.
So if I might continue our introductory remarks, I'm here representing, basically, I'm wearing multiple hats. So first of all, I'm working for the Council for Media Services. That's an independent regulatory authority in Slovakia that was for decades responsible for overseeing the Audiovisual Media Services Directive and, of course, the national law in Slovakia. And since recently, we have been designated as an authority. Well, it's called Digital Services Coordinator. We have been given the competences in this field, overseeing also the enforcement of the DSA within Slovakia. We are an active member of the European Digital Services Board. The other hat that I'm wearing is ERGA. I am the chair of the subgroup. So ERGA, first of all, is the European group of media regulators that has, since 2018, I'm looking at Paolo here, has been monitoring the original Code of Practice on Disinformation, and since then we have been present, and the subgroup that I'm leading has been a very active partner to the European Commission, fact-checkers, civil society organizations within the permanent task force that was created by the now strengthened Code of Practice on Disinformation. So I'm representing the voice of media regulators within that sphere. That's another hat. And then the third one is on the screen. I'm also the vice chair of EPRA, which is the European Platform for Regulatory Authorities, which is much of a forum rather than ERGA being the advisory body to the Commission. The European Platform for Regulatory Authority is kind of a forum under the kind of auspices of Council of Europe. So we have many more actors there. And there we also talk a lot about the new challenges when it comes to regulators in the digital space. So we talk a lot about the regulation of the services such as the audiovisual media services or video sharing platforms, when we talk about disinformation, when we talk about hate speech and so on. So this is the background that I will be covering here, and I will be glad to talk about the DSA with you, Nicola. I guess to you.
Hello everybody, my name is Nicola Frank, and I'm here today to represent the organization which is called the Lie Detectors, and I'm a member of the board of this organization, which is an independent journalistic-led media literacy organization, and its remit is to counter, as they say, the corrosive effect of online disinformation and polarization on democracy. And to do this, actually, Lie Detectors brings journalists to schools, and now also increasingly trains teachers to address these issues, so that young people and children in particular develop a critical thinking and a critical approach to media in general, but also very specifically also to social media. And I think you hear a little bit more about practices in the session which will follow. Jochen Spangenberg, who is one of the journalists involved in these courses, in these children courses, can give you a little bit more of detail. Just to give you a little bit of some figures, the lie detectors have really started, I think, in 2017, and since then they have trained 450 journalists to do that job. They trained 50,000 students, and with a focus on children from 10 to 15 years. They have reached 4,300 classrooms and 3,000 teachers, so that's like quite a lot. They're active in 7 countries. And ready to enlarge to other countries with a focus on Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, Luxembourg, and Poland. And yes, the new focus, as I said, is the training of teachers, because of course then you can multiply the effect of the training. My background is a media background, and I've worked for a long time for the European Broadcasting Union, which is the Association of Public Broadcasts. At the time, I was a member also of the so-called sounding board, which criticized a lot the first code of practice on disinformation. Paolo Celli will remember that. And so the interest of lie detectors also is here, of course, mainly on the question of disinformation and how to address that very critical issue in all its forms, and how much it impacts on democracy, really. So, yeah, that's what I'm here for today.
Thank you for the word. Good afternoon. My name is Krzysztof Kučmáš. I'm the employee of the Czech Telecommunication Office. There I work in a very ominously named Specialized Agenda Supervision Unit, which is actually dealing with all things digital, which are currently coming in when it comes to the regulation. And the reason why I'm here today is that Czech Telecommunication Office is currently designated, not yet empowered, DSC, which is the competent authority dealing with the DSA regulation. One of them, yeah, the main one. And we will be in the future, and we are already working on enforcement, and in the future we will be overseeing the enforcement of the DSA regulation. I personally deal with the international negotiations, or the parts which are still need to be done on the international floor. And since my background is in the basically security studies, I also am dealing with the topics such as disinformation or integrity of the data space.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to follow up on what you just said, because the overall theme of this panel is the implementation of the Digital Services Act. And of course, Digital Services Act as a regulation is immediately effective. However, you need to give competencies to the national authorities. So I would have a question for you and also Mr. Matějka, whether your authority already has the competencies or whether it is only designated, and what does it mean practically? What does it mean for the users? What does it mean for the platforms and so on?
I think I'm going to be faster than my Slovakian colleague. So we are designated, which means that it's very clear that we'll be the one who is going to enforce the DSA. We do not have the fully empowerment through the law, which means that we cannot enforce the DSA in the remit which falls under our, I would say, territorial scope. So Czech Telecommunication Office won't be enforcing, as of now, anything which belongs to Czechia. But we are basically present in all the working groups. We are in the communication with the European Commission. We participate in the preparation of all the delegated acts and all of the implementation acts. And we should be fully enforced in the January. So after that, or February, March, depending on how our legal representatives are gonna decide to work this. Afterwards, you can reach to us when it comes to the DSA-related questions. Before that, we are just basically doing some sort of consultations. We publish materials, but we are not actively enforcing.
Right. As I mentioned, in Slovakia, we have been given the full competencies of the Digital Services Coordinator. The regulation does give a leeway to the member states to also designate or empower competent, so-called competent authorities, and this is up to the member states to designate those. Slovak legislature decided not to nominate those or designate, so we are the sole enforcer of the DSA, as it is also with the role of a coordinator, which also by definition means that we will have to coordinate with a lot of authorities and with a lot of other actors, even non-state, so civil society. And what it practically means for us, I mean, practically speaking, we have been also kind of granted new staffing resources, which is important because the DSA is a very complex regulation. It involves a lot of work, as Christoph mentioned, on the international arena, so we do have to have a lot more people representing us within different kind of working groups that the DSA is bringing to the table, lots of topics. So we are in the process of scaling, basically, internally, and what it means for the citizens. So one thing we have decided as a coordinator, and that was kind of thought of before we actually were given these competencies, was to involve as many stakeholders as we can in the consultation processes on things that are not related to enforcement, of course, because this is our responsibility. But when it comes to consultations on various topics, such as protection of minors comes to mind and others, there are public consultations launched by the Commission. We usually refer or we go to our stakeholders in Slovakia and consult with them. And for that reason, we have created something we call Trust and Safety Network, which is basically a platform or a forum of stakeholders who are willing to participate to creating kind of position of a regulator towards these things, and not just regulator, but of course if we talk about Article 40, for example, we refer to the researchers in our country kind of finding out what are the challenges that we're facing or they're facing in Slovakia when it comes to our access to data, for example. So for the citizens themselves, of course it means that they can use the mechanisms that the DSA is now bringing to them, and they can use also us as a reference point to the issues that we can cover through our competencies.
Okay, thank you very much. Of course, the member states are not the only one who has to implement the Digital Services Act. It's mostly the platforms. So I would like to ask basically everybody on this panel, do you already see some changes on the platforms in relation to the Digital Services Act? Or are there, on the other hand, any things that just remain the same?
Should I start? Well, from what I understand, in dialogue with the platforms, there has been quite a reprioritization going on the last few years. So there has been a few years ago, there was a significant buildup of the trust and safety space within the platforms. And in recent years, the platforms have perhaps reprioritized that space somewhat. And from what we know, there's been quite a lot of people that have been let go in that realm. But, for example, Microsoft let go quite a lot of people, but started what they call now MTAC, which is a threat analysis center in New York, where they're countering disinformation. That's the hub. And they have, of course, quite a lot of other products. They have quite a lot going on, but they're focusing their work more so on this disinfo space. And the question is, will there be a difference then in how the platforms are actually able to counter disinformation? I know that Google is also, I'm looking at our Google representative in the room, they're also strengthening that space in dialogue with the threat analysts. They have quite, I would say, they've deepened their knowledge and they're sort of strengthening that within the platform itself. And so this is an interesting development. So the broad sort of spectrum of trust and safety has reconfigured itself. Another thing I would say is, for example, Meta. They have changed the way their flows look like now. The platform, sort of the way they visualize information, less news articles. Now, what does that mean? Well, what's the consequence? Well, perhaps less sort of point of opinion building, less like friction. They want to go back to what Facebook once was, when we're talking about Facebook, the platform. They want to be a platform for family and friends. Photos, just lighten that load a bit. So perhaps that is also a response to how the platform is building itself moving forward. And of course also, I know Meta is focusing more on productivity, which means AI services, the VR services that are coming. So there has been quite a significant shift. And the question is now, what does that mean? I mean, we're monitoring this as we are sort of running, and I know that the platforms are doing what they can, but the overwhelm is great, because irrelevant of what we've talked about earlier, AI, disinformation, any type of, it just blows up when there is a certain event going on, such as elections or the Southport riots in UK, or the disinformation campaign targeting Sweden by Islamist actors. What happens right around an event, it just goes berserk. And this is something that the platforms have to navigate through, as well as a nation state that is being actually targeted and attacked. So DSA and regulation, it has a slower pace. So in our dialogue with Brussels, and we have parliamentarians from Sweden that are involved in the regulatory space. We also, I would say, regularly check in with each other to address the developments as well. So that's what that's my 2 cents.
From my perspective, when we're talking about what we can see as a change since the DSA came in, so maybe 3 things. First is the protection of elections. This has been a core focus for the Commission and for the DSEs, since this is the election year that we keep hearing about in all Europe and everywhere. The Commission and the DSEs, whether they have been given powers and competencies or not, we are talking about how to develop kind of a process of working together to mitigate the risk related to whether it's foreign information manipulation or other kinds of malicious behavior when it comes to elections. So we are seeing a lot more engagement of platforms with national and local authorities in every member state that is faced with either referendum or election. So I think all of us who travel around Europe when there are elections, you can also see people from platforms traveling with the Commission and others, whether online or physically. So this is one thing that changed a lot for many member states, because it wasn't the case before. So there's a lot more focus of platforms on the elections protection, and this is very intensive here, as I said. Other thing that you might have noticed, and it may be not too related to disinformation, but I see the link a bit, is, for example, as just a case that happened, one example, I mean, when TikTok was about to introduce a TikTok Lite in Europe, the addictive design of this new feature was highlighted by, I think it was Spanish authority and some civil society actors, of course. And basically, without any kind of enforcement already done by the Commission, the kind of prevention by the regulation caused TikTok to halt its implementation in the European Union. Addictive design of these platforms is part of the potential harm and risks of these platforms. And there's another one, kind of added value of the DSA that I see now. And, well, the third, I just lost my line, so maybe it will come back to me, sorry.
From our perspective, I mean, the good thing is, of course, to have this regulation and to have a basis that people can act upon, and then the Commission has started doing this, so this is very important. So that's the biggest change probably we can see. However, I mean, there are a lot of things still which have to be improved, and yeah, I mean, there is some goodwill, but I mean, some of the platforms also don't care. I mean, we know that X, for example, withdrew from the code of practice, so that is not a good sign. And it's a clear statement that they are not willing to implement the rules of the DSA and of that code. So that is something which absolutely has to be addressed. And then I will not go into the detailed description of the situation, but there are a number of problems, in particular with regard to children. And the children, of course, go to special platforms, and they go also to an encrypted environment, and like WhatsApp or others, where it's very difficult to follow, of course, what happens. And that has not been addressed, but it's of course also very difficult to address. We appreciate that. But I mean, the main change is really that you have a solid regulation which can be acted upon.
Okay. From my perspective, I believe the first thing which always comes to mind with a question like this is, if a platform follows the rules, it will probably not say that the reason why it's doing good thing is because of the regulation. It will say it's doing it because it cares, right? So it's very hard to pinpoint whether the changes which we see now is done because platform actually cares or whether it follows the regulation. We don't care as a regulator as long as the things are done. When it comes to the practical examples, in the field of disinformation, I would say we could see some of the labeling done before the European election. It's started to appear quite consistently across platforms that there was a possibility to label, although the enforcement is sometimes was better, sometimes worse. But that would be the practical case. And then outside of disinformation, I'm sure everybody has some sort of social network. I think now you can select whether you want to see the feed which is dictated by the algorithm or by the, let's say, the previous social network analysis, right? Whether you will see the feed of never-ending videos or the stuff which your friends post. And this is one of the requirements of DSA regulation. And in last year, it started to appear in every bigger platform. So I guess it might have been because of the DSA, but we will never know.
Yeah, of course.
Just have one or two more points. This is all like really good, makes me think of things. But one thing that I've been monitoring closely is, of course, the requirement of the DSA for the tech platforms, social media platforms, to not just transparency, but also in the content moderation space, which is that very delicate sort of fine line, content moderation versus freedom of speech. And this is something at the start when this sort of came about. We had meetings with Commissioner Jourova 2 years ago when she visited the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. And since then, we've had really good talks back and forth. Basically, what I was worried about was that perhaps the social media platforms would kind of overcompensate and start like remove information so that they wouldn't get fined. This is within the DSA space now, has sort of not been as much of a problem, which is good to see. But I know that the platforms were talking about pre-bunking, pre-threat, so that was something that I kept an eye on closely. Another thing that I wanted also to sort of monitor was not just content moderation, but just also like cultural impact, because many of these VLOPs, they are American. So how to differentiate sort of the US American space and that cultural aspect of removing information vis-a-vis like a European country. Would that be affected? We haven't really seen as much of that either. So it's just interesting to see that my initial worries have not really manifested themselves. However, content moderation and freedom of speech is still a very, 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 like, it's just a minefield.
Yeah, thank you. I actually wanted to ask you what is like the biggest misconception about the DSA, but I think you just answered by what you said. But let's move to illegal content, because it will also like follow the content moderation and the freedom of speech you just mentioned, because DSA is really connected to like illegal content and the removal of content from the platforms. And my question will go to Mr. Kučmář and Mr. Matějka, because you are here as a representative of the regulatory body. So do you think that the national digital services coordinators will have to assess whether certain content is illegal or not? You may start.
Thank you. So the regulation itself doesn't prescribe this role to the coordinators themselves. What we are supposed to be looking at as the DSCs is looking at the systemic risk, basically, together with the Commission, because when it comes to VLOPs, the Commission is the enforcer there. So specifically, I'm talking about Article 16. So the platforms are mandated by the DSA to have proper mechanisms for the users to report illegal content to them. And what we are looking at, as regulators cooperating with the Commission, is whether these mechanisms that are put in place currently are sufficiently effective when it comes to both protection of fundamental rights, like freedom of expression, and whether they are actually mitigating the risks of spread of illegal content. Slovak situation is a bit more complex. I'm not sure whether there is time to kind of go into this, but even before the DSA was coming into effect in Slovakia, the new media law gave us powers in certain areas of illegal content that we now have competence to issue removal orders for specific pieces of illegal content related to terrorism content, child pornography, extremism, and such things as denial of a Holocaust. But this is not related to DSA. This was done before, and I think we are the outlier within the DSE community at the moment. So the assessment of the illegality of the content remains with the courts, with the police and the prosecutor's office in many member states, from my knowledge. But the DSEs are not there, I believe, to assess the illegality of the content in general.
Okay, thank you very much for this question, especially since you wanted to talk about the biggest misconceptions. I believe this is one of them. The DSEs are really not required to, or even asked, except for one specific question, which is up to debate in court, I guess, eventually. But by definition, we are not supposed to in any way assess whether the content is illegal or not. When we think about the DSC, I believe the very useful analogy or metaphorical expression is that the DSA is basically a pipeline which allows the laws which already exist to be enforced in a space where they were not able to be enforced before, right? So if you have stuff which is illegal and it was set, let's say, in a classic printed media, you would be able to somehow go to the media houses and enforce this, right? But if you had a big technological scene where the companies were half Europe, half American, half Chinese, sometimes they were like, no, we don't care about this, it's not in our, we don't have a control over this, then you couldn't effectively enforce it. This is a thing which the DSC is trying to basically remedy, to create an effective pipeline which allows enforcement of the laws which are valid in the offline world to be valid in the online world, to use a buzzword, which Madame Jourova would be very happy about using, but she's not here. But yeah, that's what Commission used to say. So no, we are not, I don't think we will be ever, maybe in some very specific cases, assess whether the content is illegal or not. This falls outside of our scope. And I think I'm going to just very quickly touch on a difference, which is also not very clear. My colleague Stano is from Council of Media, and I'm from the telecommunication regulator. In some countries, it's done by the media councils, the DSC. Sometimes it's done by the telco regulators. The media councils have different laws, which they very often enforce. They were dealing with the content for a long time, while telco regulators deal with the pipelines, with the cables. So there's a much higher chance that some of the councils will be a bit more active than the telco regulators, which will usually be very much more passive in this sense. But the reason why they're active is not because of the DSC, but because of some other law which they might have.
Can I also say?
Yeah, of course.
On this particular point, it's also interesting to see that there are, I mean, not so new developments, but developments which are a bit worrying. And the EBU, for example, broadcasters report that their members experience a proliferation of fake content posing as reputable media brands and journalists. So what it's called celebrity scam to a certain extent. So what people really do, they fake news and use the brand of a media, supposedly, and that's, of course, extremely dangerous because then the user will not know. I mean, if they trust a certain media, they would go and believe the news and trust the content, but then if this is a fake business, it's very dangerous. Now, broadcasters apparently have reported this to platforms, but the platforms are not acting upon. So the question is now, should this be regarded as illegal content because they are misusing trademarks and they're infringing copyright and also personal rights? Would that be, would you regard this as illegal content which has to be taken off?
I think I might have a very, very quick answer. Technically, before in the e-commerce directive, all the platforms were responsible for illegal content on their web page if they knew about it. The tricky part was that all the platforms would never allow you to actually report them any kind of content in a way which would be proven. So now, with the DSA, Article 16 and 14, there's a way how to report them illegal content. And once they knew about the illegal content, they're liable for the damages. So if the broadcasters reported the content to the platforms, now if they went to court, the platform cannot say that they do not know about the content. That is the difference which DSC offers in a very specific way. I know it's not exactly a good answer or the answer which was everybody expecting, but that's how the law, in our understanding at least, works.
Maybe one.
Yeah, of course.
Just very briefly, of course, going to the court is a good thing, but very late. So the damage is then done, of course. Yeah.
Interesting with this whole matter of the news sites is that you see AI services used to generate text for the articles. So it's rather not the deep fakes and the worry that was talked about at the beginning of the year with, AI is the road to basic, the world will go under, but it's more about information laundering at this point. And also what these adversarial actors are doing with these news sites is that they are actually creating URLs that are not visible sort of to a user. It doesn't say The Guardian or Der Spiegel or whatnot. It says it's just a URL shortening version of it, and that's disseminated through social media platforms, and then AI services are used to generate commentary texts. So it's all part of that infrastructure that I was talking about earlier, and media and journalism is really caught in the middle of this. It's quite serious, actually.
Okay, let me give a model situation. Let's say that a user comes across something that seems like illegal content on a platform. And for the sake of the story, it is not a very large online platform, so you will not say it's for the commission. And the user flags this as illegal content. And the platform doesn't do anything. So the user flags this again, and the platform is still not removing it. So in this scenario, if the user comes to the digital services coordinator, what will the digital services coordinator do? Will they not do anything, which would be in line with what you said, or what would happen? Because it's clearly the responsibility of the platform to remove the content. So what would happen?
So I would start maybe with a general remark that, and maybe repeating myself, that what we're looking at is what's in the regulation, and it doesn't say that the DSC is supposed to assess whether the report by the user has any kind of, we can look at the formal side of things, but not necessarily on the content itself as the DSC. So let's put apart the media regulation part that we're looking at the content, but in different setups. What we will be looking at is whether the mechanism itself works well, and then, as Christoph, I think, alluded to, there are courts that can issue removal orders and kind of assess, first of all, of course, assess whether the content is illegal, and then when it happens, this is an Article 9 then issue. This is the removal order from the authority that is with the competencies of issuing one. So we can collect evidence, as a DSCs as well, kind of looking into whether the platforms, yes, we're not talking about flops, but still whether there is some kind of systemic problem with the service, although platforms do not fall within the risk assessment and everything related to this. But this is the role of the coordinator. So it's not, so DSA is not introducing a new authority to replace courts, basically, what I would summarize it.
So, thank you, Stano, for the descriptive. I'm going to be a bit more concrete. We would look whether all the process requirements in the DSA were followed. So firstly, was the possibility to report content done in a way which is concise and understandable to the user? Could he easily report illegal content? Yes or no? If yes, okay, that's good. Then did the platform inform the user about the fact that what they are planning to do, whether they can take a decision or not? Yes or no? If that works, yes. That's another thing which we would check. And then thirdly, of course, if we knew about some possibility of a crime, something which falls into the general criminal law, then we as an office are obliged to pass it to the relevant authorities. So if somebody would report some crime such as violence or anything, I would say this physical, then we would contact the police. But that's not from the DSC or DSA regulation. That's the general practice of all the public offices. So I guess we would just look at the process side of the thing, and then on the whether we should follow it or push it further or not.
Okay, we just talked about the illegal content in general, but let's focus on disinformation, which may or may not be illegal. There are certain responsibilities of the very large online platforms under Article 34 and 35, and a lot of it deals with some sort of like systemic threat. So do you think that the disinformation may fall within the category of the systemic threat, and would this mean that there might be a responsibility of the very large online platforms to actually remove the disinformation or not? Whoever would like to respond.
Well, I can say that disinformation is a clear threat towards our democracies. It's been stated earlier today, it's been stated from the World Economic Forum, and it is something that we have to combat. Now, it falls on all of us as well as recipients of disinformation. It's usually what I say in Sweden when I go out and talk to our population. I say, you're all part of the Swedish psychological defense, which means that you all here are part of your country's psychological defense. So resilience building and just really awareness raising, all of those efforts are within our mandate. That's what we bring into the picture. So it's not just on the platforms, but it's been quite clear for the last few years that the information space is overwhelmed. So it hasn't really worked, hasn't it, up until now? So what can the platforms do to adjust? So the transparency reports is something that has been helpful into the space. However, the reports can also be used by adversarial actors to learn from what the platforms are doing in removing the various networks and how they address disinformation. So it's a really difficult space to navigate. So, you know, whatever can be done is perhaps where I would again advocate a bit to the way Sweden is approaching it. We learn everything that we can about the tactics, methods, narratives, and from that perspective we can counter or put forth suggestions on how to counter. And we have also a clear mandate in Sweden to support anyone that would be attacked, any agency, any entity, any journalistic or media entity. So that's one way of doing it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I believe also disinformation can be a systemic risk, and it depends also on the subject they're dealing with. I mean, and in the DSA, there are some criteria for systemic risk, and they mention democratic processes, civic discourse, electoral process, public security, and so on. So this can all be linked to disinformation, and if it is, then becomes a systemic risk, I believe. And it's important to act upon. Now, maybe because we don't have much time, and I'd like to address a little bit media literacy, also why this is important in this context. And we all see that DSA is a very good regulation, and the code of practice is also useful, but regulation and implementation of regulation will always be behind technical developments and new ideas of those who want to disinform, who want to lie, and who want to manipulate. So it will always be regulation in this context is sort of cleaning up the mess which is created by others. So as long as the energy of those who want to disinform and manipulate is bigger than the energy of some of the platforms to address the issue, we will never get there in a way. It's important to implement, but at the same time, it's so important to develop critical thinking. And this is what media literacy tries to do, because in the end, I mean, everybody has to judge for himself or herself whether he or she can trust a certain source, and which we already said becomes increasingly difficult. However, I mean, there are certain techniques and which can be learned, and we strongly believe that media literacy should become really part of the official curricula in schools and education, generally speaking, in the EU. And there is some hope, because also in the framework of the EMFA, I mean, the board apparently is supposed to look at media literacy, also exchange experiences, and so that there is some hope that there's some understanding at the EU level to introduce this, because education is of course a national competence, but that member states will be motivated to introduce that generally as a key skill to be taught in schools. Thank you.
So Paolo, Peter, and I think Milan and others have been talking about the code of practice before. So the code of practice since 2018 has brought together various actors, and it kind of, by this time around 2024, now we are 2 years into the new strengthened code of practice, we have together with the platforms and others created sort of that I see as an industry standard that could still need some development and more actions from the platforms. This is still to be discussed, how more effective it could become. But what I'm trying to say by this, Nicola was more efficient than me looking for specific quotations when the regulation itself mentions the areas of systemic risk, and many of those, if not all of them, are somehow linked to disinformation, or could be linked to disinformation as well, in public health and civic discourse and elections integrity and so on. The Code of Practice has introduced many chapters how the platforms that by then willingly or voluntarily should mitigate the risk of their own services being abused by malicious actors spreading disinformation using manipulative behavior, tactics and techniques. Now this is on the paper and it has been developed by a large group of various stakeholders. Its effectiveness, could be discussed by many of us for many years now, but this is developed, and we now, and I think Commission as the enforcer of the DSA, has the kind of set of rules, if I might call them, or criteria, when they will be looking at the risk assessments that are coming now from the platforms to the Commission. And then the auditing comes in as well, and hopefully it will contribute, but as Paolo said, there are some questions or marks around this, whether it will. But there is a monitoring framework within the Code of Practice that still needs to be developed further, and I think all of these together can contribute to the DSA actually becoming more effective in countering or kind of helping mitigate the risk of disinformation through the Code of Conduct. I don't know if we will have the time to go into the specifics of the conversion that's happening now, but the Code of Practice will become part of the kind of mitigation measures of the platforms when it comes to systemic risks. And this is very complex and it will take time, and I understand, from the civil society point of view, this is not, fast enough. And by the way, media literacy is one of the strong chapters within the Code of Practice where platforms are committing themselves to work more, finance more, both fact checkers work and media literacy development. So I'll finish there.
Yeah, we don't only have the Digital Services Act and the Code of Practice, but we also have something called the Media Freedom Act, which is another regulation coming, and it's slightly controversial because Hungary is currently trying to make it annulled in front of the CGEU. And of course, this new regulation is not about user content, it's more about the journalistic content, and it also includes a lot of obligations for the very large online platforms. And I will have another question for Mr. Matyka in this regard. What does the Media Freedom Act mean for the digital services, and does it mean that the very large online platforms in certain cases may, for example, block some content on their platform?
So, we can talk at length about this is the whole new regulation, so this is a bit more simplistic maybe. But, the controversial part within the negotiations around EMFA was, of course, by then it was Article 17. I think the final text talks about this within Article 18, and it's so-called media privilege. I think it's called, which basically means that very large online platforms are obliged to have a process in place whenever they want to use their content moderation practices against the editorial content. So when there are media outlets that are being designated as such or labeled as such, their content has to go through different process when the platforms want to implement their content moderation policies. This doesn't apply, of course, to illegal content because this is a clear line of the DSA. But when it comes to the platforms, specifically VLOPs, trying to moderate other types of, let's call it harmful but lawful content that is being published on their services by the editorial media, they can't do it as fast as they would do it with my personal account, for example. There's a process to be followed within EMFA that should protect the editorial content, because the discussions about disinformation and the DSA later on, when it was negotiated, there was a very strong voice from the journalism community criticizing the fact that platforms are over-moderating their content, which is editorial. So there is a editorial integrity of the media put in place, and their content is being over-moderated. And this is what EMFA is trying to, or will try to, kind of mitigate or regulate better.
Okay, thank you very much. We are almost at the end with this panel because it's already 3 o'clock. I have like one final question for everyone, and then we will open the floor for the audience. So my question is, because DSA is also a lot about data access and about transparency. So do you think that the Digital Services Act will help with understanding the whole ecosystem of the platforms and will actually help to make the platforms more transparent? Yeah. Oh, okay, we may take it from this side.
Yeah. So that's a very good question. Thank you for that. Right now, I think 5 days ago, the European Commission has published a draft of the Delegated Act, which basically defines the rules. How can researchers access data of the very large online platforms? This will allow, I think, most of you, because I guess this is a research conference, to basically look at the stuff which was asked in the morning by you and also by Madam Jourova when you were speaking about the need to basically assess what is the disinformation doing. The vetted researchers, Delegated Act, and the tools which DSA has allows researchers to look inside of the platforms. So this will not help you with understanding what is it doing from the societal perspective, but it will help with understanding what is going on inside. So this draft Delegated Act, it has 3 weeks basically right now before it will be the window for the consultation will end, and during this time anybody can comment. We as a CHTU has asked all of the research organizations which we knew about and which we are in contact with to comment on this, but anybody can. It's European Union, it's open consultation, so whoever writes there, if he has a sound point, he can mention it. So I would highly advise you to look at this article and comment whatever you see there, whether it might work for a researcher or not, because the Delegated Act will be very important in the way how this is enforced. Then the DSCs will play a role. We will be there to help you with your research requests, mostly Irish, because most of the platforms are in Ireland, but still, we will be somehow helping. But the way how the Delegated Act is written is going to be very important in the way how the access is granted. Otherwise, apart from this, we also have the Implementing Act on the transparency reporting, which is valid now, and you can see the European Union Transparency Database, and you can already see what are the platforms doing when it comes to moderation, which of course includes also the disinformation. So you already have some sort of data you can look at, and then of course the platforms should give you access to the open data, according to Article 4012 of the DSA, which should help you to basically get APIs and see what is going on there to base your research request on this. But please check out the consultation, and thank you for this question. I guess the others will have much more to say.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in the question. I hope it will improve access for researchers, because I know in the past it was very difficult. This will certainly help also to clarify certain issues which are still on the table, like the link between monetization, advertising models, and the polarization of content, and all, how content travels. So that is one of the issues which we believe that needs to be looked at very closely in this context.
So I alluded to the fact in specific Slovak case that we have created this network of stakeholders to consult, and we're doing this with the aim, of course, also so the aim of this is to be informed about the harms that we're faced as a nation, but also within the EU. So having researchers looking into whether it's protection of minors, whether it's disinformation, whether it's anything else around addictive designs, all of this, when they have the access to data and they do the proper research and they publish it, and it's kind of peer-reviewed and so on, it can inform the work of both the Commission and the regulators in the near future. Because I'm talking about these openly, the DSCs, neither, I think, the Commission will become a center of excellence for every online harm there is, and we need a researchers community to help us kind of identify those risks, and then we are there to kind of see the procedural part of the issue. But I can only second what Christoph said. Like, take a look at the consultation that is now open and have your say, because this is the time when you can actually, I think, make a change and have actual access to data, and maybe look at specifically what your needs are when it comes to structure of the data. How are these coming to you from the platforms? Thank you.
Briefly, I mean, I second what Nicola said, and I just want to mention that 10% of our funding goes towards research, independent research, and we also fund a psychological defense institute at Lund University, for example, where threats and vulnerabilities, but also Stratcom. There's a few studies that come out of there, so if anyone's interested, you can go and have a look. One of our latest studies that sort of come from my desk is threats involving the gaming environment as a digital platform. And I also want to mention that the agency has in 2 cycles now launched something called the Don't Be Fooled campaign. It's a national campaign directed towards a general audience, and it started in conjunction with our own elections in 2022. And so who wants to be fooled, right? So it's less emphasis, it was from the start, on disinformation, not to worry the population, and now we've sort of increased the rhetorics, and we're talking about disinformation, but misleading information and propaganda directed towards our country, just to emphasize Russia as being the main threat towards Europe and Sweden, as well as the US elections, for example. So we, in our strategic communications efforts, are really trying to build that psychological defense in Sweden, and research and researchers are very much part of that.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the audience? Somebody just stood up, but I don't know if they have a question. Okay, it seems that we don't.
I might have.
You have a question, okay.
Well, maybe a story about the transparency, just to follow up. I follow some weird YouTube channels about tech people who do some weird stuff from USA or Canada, and they recently mentioned, look, this favorite social platform where the head is very much proponent of the free speech, we all know which one I'm mentioning, has just recently accepted an order from Turkey to remove some content. Mm-hmm. And guess where they found out about it? In the transparency report. So there's a certain effect already going on with the transparency reports of the various online platforms, but also in the small ones, etc. So some sort of movement in the transparency area is already going on, and yeah. So that's just a small story.
Okay. I thank each of our panelists very much for attending this panel, and also I thank the audience for their attendance, and that's it from us. If you have any more questions, I think you can approach all of our guests during the coffee break.